Hello and a warm welcome to the hashtag No Precarious Work webinar series organized by the European Confederation of Independent Trade Unions, CESI. I'm Aurora Triff. I'm an associate professor at Dublin University in Ireland. I'm specialized in comparative employment relations, and I have been invited by CESI to lead this webinar because I have coordinated an EU project on precarious work in 5 sectors across 10 countries, mostly from Eastern Europe. And I'm going to share with you some of the findings of this project. I have also invited my colleague Aisling Seeley, who is currently doing a PhD in Dublin University, to share her practical insights on how to deal with precarious work. Aisling has been involved with Irish and international trade unions over the last 10 years or so. And in this seminar, Aisling and I are going to discuss the answer to 2 interrelated questions. First, why should unions address the interests of precarious workers? And secondly, if unions decide to do so, how can they address the interests of precarious workers? How can they take successful actions to address it? Particularly in a context of weakening of power resources. And by power resources, we mean different internal and external sources that union can rely on to take successful actions, while we will not make specific reference to financial resources. And the short answer to both questions is that unions need to take a pragmatic approach. In relation to the why question, similar to very recent CESI's reports, we argue that union survival is at stake if they don't change their strategy from excluding precarious workers to including them. And we are going to give you some examples to show how even the strongest unions in Europe had to do so when precarity threatened all workers. In relation to the second question, to the how question, we also argue that unions need to have a pragmatic approach. And by this we mean that unions need to focus on issues that have potential benefits for all parties, including workers on standard contracts and workers on non-standard contracts. And we will give you some examples of successful and unsuccessful union actions, particularly in healthcare and temporary agency work sectors that are of special interest to CESI members. And now I would like to invite Aisling to share her understanding of precarity based on her practical experience.
Hi, my name is Aisling Seeley, and I'm very happy to be part of this webinar. I'm going to begin by introducing some characteristics of precarity. The term precarious covers a wide range of work. It traditionally includes work that is temporary, such as fixed-term contracts, and indirect, such as agency work. However, not all such work is precarious. Precarity is determined by certain characteristics, which include uncertainty, unpredictability, and high level of risk associated with the work. In some cases, the precarious nature of work is not immediately apparent. To give a personal example, I am working on a PhD funded by the Irish Research Council. I have been working with unions and NGOs for 14 years and recently returned to the research following maternity leave. When COVID-19 led to the closure of childcare facilities, I was forced to pause my research. The precarious nature of my work then became apparent. I discovered I was not entitled to the pandemic unemployment payment that 600,000 workers whose employment was interrupted as a result of the crisis received. Many workers who are engaged in non-standard work are in a similar situation to me. Now, without the benefit of the social welfare system, we are forced to take on even more precarious work in order to make ends meet.
I want to add that the expansion of precarious working conditions for highly skilled young professionals such as junior doctors, teachers, architects, and even Google workers is a relatively new phenomenon. In Google, contract workers have outnumbered direct employees in 2018. Therefore, we see that precarious, non-standard contracts are becoming the norm even in companies and sectors that employed highly qualified workers. Interestingly, Google employees together with contractors have organized a collective action in 2018 to address the alleged abuse of power in relation to gender issues. As you may know, the Android creator Andy Rubin, who was accused of sexual misconduct, was gifted a $90 million exit package after Google found about it. The worldwide protests of Google workers were a reaction to his exit package. And in addition to asking for a change in the procedures of dealing with sexual harassment, protesters also asked for representation in the management board, and more specifically, they wanted to have something similar to a workers director or labor director that is found, for instance, in large German companies. So we see that even highly skilled Google workers realize that they need to get together to advance their interests. And their action was inspired by the Me Too movement, which deals with gender issues. Nevertheless, I would argue that the abuse of power is common for all groups of vulnerable workers, including migrants and young workers. And we have seen, particularly post-2008, that a lot of highly skilled young workers have insecure jobs, have non-standard contracts. So I would argue that a hashtag no precarious work movement is needed to stop, to prevent the abuses that all vulnerable groups suffer. And my main point is that all of us, including highly skilled workers, need collective support to ensure that there is no abuse of power by those in senior positions. Moreover, only together and often through collective actions, we can decide what type of society we want to live in. And I would argue that unions should take such opportunities as Google protests to work with Googlers to make a better society. And now I would like to ask Aisling to discuss a little bit more about changes, about shifts in precarious work.
Precarious work is not new, but it is changing. This change was augmented by the economic crisis of 2008. Traditionally, precarious work was largely restricted to the private sector. The garment industry, which my research concentrates on, is an archetypal example. Garment workers are predominantly concentrated in less developed countries with weak labour protections and are generally classified as low-skilled. These workers can be easily replaced, reducing their bargaining power. Often, garment workers are employed on non-standard contracts, be it of a part-time, fixed-term or indirect nature. Such characteristics are typical of traditional definitions of precarious work. However, in the last 12 years or so, precarity has grown in sectors with strong trade unions and high collective bargaining rates, such as the public sector. Here in Ireland, we have seen this spread of precarity. Precarious work in Ireland was traditionally concentrated in particular industries, such as those affected by seasonality, like tourism and agriculture. Recent studies of the workforce in Ireland indicate an increase in the various forms of non-standard employment. Although employment levels increased from 2008 to 2016, the percentage of full-time permanent employment diminished. While employers argue that flexible work benefits all sides, over half of workers on fixed-term contracts who were surveyed say that their preference was for permanent employment. What is clear is that precarity is now an issue for many workers who are in sectors traditionally considered to be secure. In Ireland, the composition of the public sector workforce was altered considerably by a recruitment ban introduced in response to the economic crisis of 2008. This banned recruitment of permanent and temporary workers in all but exceptional circumstances, which needed to be approved at ministerial level. A government scheme incentivised early retirement, with retiring workers not replaced. At the same time, the public sector spend on agency work increased dramatically. Ireland's Health Service Executive more than doubled its spending on agency work in the last decade. Although the moratorium on recruitment ended in 2015, its effects are long-lasting. In 2019, the Health Service Executive spent almost €1 million a day on agency workers. Last year, members of the Irish Nurses and Midwives organisation went on national strike for only the second time in the union's 100-year-long history. 95% of the union's members had voted in favour of the strike, with discontentment with recruitment and retention key contributing factors. The strike only came to an end following the Labour Court's recommendation of improvements to terms and conditions of employment, which would be funded in part by reductions in spending on agency staff. Precarity is also an issue for workers on standard contracts due to low incomes. In Ireland, the percentage of permanent workers who reported that they were living comfortably on their income fell by 10% between 2004 and 2016. Nearly 1/3 of workers report that they cannot afford to meet an unexpected expense.
The figures on this slide show in a simplified manner the links between precarious workers and trade unions in the past and present time. In the past, unions rarely have focused their efforts on addressing the interests of precarious workers. In a context of expansion of precarity combined with a decline of trade union membership, more unions have changed their strategies from exclusion to inclusion in recent times. Now I would like to give you two examples of expansions of precarity and union responses to it. The first example is based on a study by Benassi and Origatti of the IG Metall union. Their study shows that even in the German metal sector, where workers are represented by arguably the strongest union in Europe, there has been an expansion of precarity by an increased use of agency workers. And while initially IG Metall focused their efforts on defending the interests of their core members, since 2007, it has started recruiting agency workers and promoting their equal treatment. Also, agency work has become a central issue in sectoral bargaining, which contributed to a reduction of the gap between agency and standard workers. And this case of IG Metall shows that even relatively strong unions can no longer afford to ignore the interests of precarious workers, as precarity threatens all workers. The second example shows how precarity expands towards Northern Europe. In a recent book of Ginny Dølgast and her colleagues, I have found a fascinating story about developments in a Danish slaughterhouse that has subsidiaries in Germany and Denmark. And in Germany, this company pays its worker 3 times less than in Denmark. And I was shocked by the fact that this Danish firm threatened the Danish workers to relocate to Germany in 2014 if they don't accept lower wages. And it was just over a decade ago when German companies used to threaten their workers that they will relocate to Eastern Europe to reduce labor costs, while now we see Danish companies relocating to Germany for the same reason. And the Danish union was successful in stopping the relocation of the factory to Germany and maintain higher wages via sectoral collective bargaining by unionizing all workers. The authors of this paper, Refslund and Wagner, indicated that in Denmark there is a tradition of union representing all workers, including migrant workers, which is not the case in Germany. In the German factory, workers set up a works council, but without the support of a union, this works council did not manage to improve their working conditions or wages. So, moreover, other empirical studies in this book have shown that in recent years, in Germany, there is a weak capacity of implementation of rules and laws, which has become similar to Eastern Europe. Thus, it might be useful considering that employers in Western Europe have learned from their operation in Eastern Europe or from their counterparts from Eastern Europe how to reduce the labor costs. So it might be useful also for unions from Western Europe to learn from their counterparts from Eastern Europe how to use their limited internal and external resources to successfully address precarity in an adverse context for labor. So I do hope that the findings of our project in Eastern Europe will also be relevant for unions in Western Europe. And before I make reference to our own project, I would like to make a final point related to the question, why should all unions address the interests of precarious workers? And while it is notoriously difficult to make predictions, based on developments over the last 20 years or so, it appears very likely that a continuation of the current trend will lead to a further expansion of precarity combined with a decline in union membership. And the 2 examples from Western Europe and our findings reveal that unions are a vital intermediary actor between precarious workers and employers. And unions can help to improve their working conditions and to ensure that the working conditions of their core members on standard contracts are not becoming more precarious. Yet, precarious workers are also becoming vital for union survival in a context of expanding precarity to more than half of the labor force, as we have seen in the case of Google. Consequently, in line with the recent report of CESI, we argue that a further shift in union strategy is needed, more specifically, a pragmatic shift to focus on representing the interests of precarious workers is likely to make it possible for unions to maintain their social role in the society and at least reduce the pace of the expansion of precarity. And now I'd like to provide an overview of our project and present some of its findings. Our EU project was called The Rise of Dual Labour Market, Fighting Precarious Work Through Employment Relations, and it was abbreviated to PRECARIR. And it focused on trade union responses to precarious work since 2008. And it covered 9 Eastern European countries and Greece, while I'm going to focus on the 9 countries from Eastern Europe. And these countries can be grouped into 3 categories contingent on the strength of their employment protection, particular legislation. And in the first category, with the strongest protection, is Slovenia. In the middle are Czechia, Croatia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, while the weakest protection is in Latvia and Lithuania. And although there is variation, for instance, even within or among the 6 countries in the middle, what we have found is that there is a weak capacity of implementation of labor laws and the provisions of collective agreements across all 9 countries. In relation to the sectors, we have investigated developments in 5 sectors, and we group those into 2 categories contingent on union power resources. More specifically, the 2 sectors with the stronger power resources are healthcare and metal, while the other 3 sectors, namely retail, construction, and temporary agency work, unions have weaker power resources, and the key difference between the 2 is workers' capacity to disrupt production, and which is weaker in the last 3 sectors, and that's primarily because it is easier to replace workers in retail, construction, and temporary agency work. And now I would like to provide you an overview of the incidence of precarious work across those 9 countries since 2008. And similar to previous research, we have found that non-standard workers have the most precarious working conditions, but the expansion of non-standard work actually has been less than we expected, considering the major deregulation of the labor market since 2008. And the main reason for that is the fact that there has been an erosion and an increased power of employers to use irregular working time for standard workers. And in relation to the gap between the quality of working conditions for standard and non-standard workers, we group those 9 countries into 3 categories. So we found that there has been an increased gap in Croatia, Czechia, Poland, and Slovakia through the expansion of non-standard contracts. And although there have been some changes in relation to workers on standard contracts, in terms of lower legal protection as well as a reduction of collective bargaining coverage, the legal changes that make it easier for employers to use non-standard contracts led to a huge expansion of workers on non-standard contracts. And for instance, in Croatia, it was reported that most workers after 2008 were on non-standard contracts, most new contracts. In the second category, we have a limited change in the Baltic states, where there was limited protection even before 2008, while actually in those countries we have seen an increase of protection of some forms of non-standard work, such as agency workers. And finally, in the third category, something that we did not expect was the reduction of the gap between the quality of jobs for standard and non-standard workers by the erosion of standard employment. And we have seen this in Hungary, Romania, and Slovenia, and it was primarily linked to an undermining of statutory collective rights, and which led to a major reduction in collective bargaining coverage, and also, for instance, in Romania, it led to an increase in the share of workers on minimum wage. And interestingly, we've seen this also in Greece, and more recently, we've seen a study which showed that in Portugal, the International Monetary Fund in 2010 also recommended reducing the employment protection for regular workers to put them on a more equal footing with temporary workers. So therefore, we see that also in Western Europe, the deterioration of working conditions for workers on standard contracts has already started. In relation to the incidence of precarious work across sectors, we see, as expected, the highest incidence of precarious work in retail and construction, and particularly in most countries, new work contracts are non-standards, and also in all countries we see a high incidence of informal work, either in the form of cash in hand or no employment contract in those two sectors. In metal and healthcare, we see a moderate increase in precarious work. In healthcare, we have seen an increase in the share of workers on low wages, as well as an increase in irregular working time, particularly involuntary unpaid overtime. While in the metal sector, we have seen an increase of subcontracting, and also an increase in the use of agency workers. And finally, in the case of temporary agency work, we see a variable incidence of precarity. Now, overall agency workers have poorer working conditions than standard workers, but there have been exceptions. And for instance, in Lithuania, where there is strong protection for agency workers, their average wages are higher than for standard workers, while a more common case would be in the case of Romania, for instance. I was told by an employer of a temporary agency that around 10% of agency workers have higher wages than their counterparts, while around 90% of agency workers have poorer working conditions, despite the fact that in most countries there are laws that require employers to have similar, and certainly in relation to pay, to have the same pay for agency and standard workers that are doing the same job. So overall, what we see across the 5 sectors is that unions were unable to prevent the expansion of precarity during the 2008 crisis. Nevertheless, in all sectors, we also have seen that unions were able to take successful actions to improve at least some dimensions of precarity. And we looked at specifically 4 dimensions of precarity, namely lower uncertain income or wage, irregular and uncertain working hours, high job insecurity, and the lack of union representation. And we look at whether unions have managed to improve these 4 dimensions for standard and non-standard workers. And based on interviews with senior union officials as well as representatives of employers in each sector, we identify the main union actions targeting specific dimension by sectors within a country. And we coded as successful actions when at least a union action that improved a specific dimension in a particular sector within a country was reported. And this information is hopefully useful in order to understand the table on the next slide, which provides an overview of successful and unsuccessful union actions in 3 out of the 5 sectors, just to simplify it. And I have included healthcare and agency work that is of special interest to SESI members, while I have also included retail because it is a more traditional sector with where unions have weak power resources. So as you can see in this table, in relation to wage, we see that unions in 8 countries in healthcare and retail were able to take successful actions. In relation to voice, we see that unions in 5 countries actually were able to organize workers in retail, while only in 3 countries in the case of the healthcare sector. And similarly, in relation to working time, which is a major issue in healthcare, we have seen that there were in more countries successful actions in retail compared to healthcare. While with regard to job security, we actually see that in relation to agency work, there were more successful actions than in relation to healthcare, but maybe because healthcare workers generally have high job security. Overall, what we see in this table is that unions have comparable degree of success in addressing specific dimensions of precarity in sectors with weaker and stronger resources. And why this is important is because this means that the success of union actions is primarily determined by their internal resources, is not necessarily contingent on the sectoral resources. And now I'm going to discuss and provide you examples of how unions can use their own resources to take successful action. Unions that have decided to have an inclusive strategy towards precarious workers need to look for opportunity to address their interests. And this process of assessing challenges and opportunities in the given context and developing a suitable plan of action is linked to proactivity. Proactivity refers to the ability of union officials to initiate and frame their own agenda vis-à-vis employers or the government. And it is reflected in the capacity of union leaders to develop clear objectives and to pursue them through actions. In particular, fostering an inclusive attitude of their members to support union actions is necessary to address precarity. And despite the adverse context for unions in Eastern Europe after the 2008, our findings show that unions were able to improve specific dimensions of precarity, such as low wages and workers' voice, in each sector in most countries. But this has happened only when unions were able to take advantage of the opportunities that arose in their context. Also, unions had to address only one or two dimensions of precarity at a time. In other words, the purpose of union actions often had to be narrow. And our findings show that the first aspect that unions need to determine is which dimension of precarity is feasible to be improved in the given context. And unions need to consider the interests of all workers, not only precarious workers, as well as employers' views on precarity dimension. Then they need to choose to tackle the dimension that is the most likely to be improved. They may not be the most important challenge that workers face. And unions need to develop a credible win-win discourse for all parties involved. In particular, unions need to inform their members about the benefits, it could be the long-term benefits for them to represent the interests of precarious workers. This is also very important to gain the support of precarious workers and wider community for their actions. In Eastern Europe, the most common dimension of precarity that unions thought to address in each sector across countries, it was low wage. In a context where average wages in Eastern Europe for non-managerial employees are around 10 times lower than in Western Europe. Similar to Western Europe, in the public sector, an important issue during the 2008 recession was wage cuts, which resulted in an increase of nurses and junior doctors on minimum wage. And for instance, I have collected data for our project in Romania, and I was told that junior doctors, when they start their career, have lower wages than experienced porters or cleaners. And so overall, the austerity measures during the 2008 crisis have increased the workload for both nurses and doctors. And in order to ensure the safety of patients, many of them had to work long hours, which resulted in unpaid overtime. In this context, healthcare unions in several countries such as Czechia, Hungary and Slovakia used resignation campaigns to increase wages. These radical union actions were facilitated by the shortage of healthcare personnel in these countries as well as in neighboring Western European countries. And following an individual exit strategy of many doctors and nurses, meaning that many of them have emigrated to work in Western Europe, unions seized the opportunity to take collective action in the form of resignation campaigns. An illustration of the success and failure of resignation campaigns to address low wages was found in Slovakia. The doctors' union succeeded in gaining a legislatively stipulated wage increase, while a similar action by nurses and midwives' union has failed. And the main difference between the action of doctors and nurses was that doctors were able to formulate a clear objective that resonated with both their members and wider community. So doctors' unions persuaded their members that by acting together, their demands would be met by the government. And also these unions convinced the public that by siding with the doctors, they would avoid the collapse of the healthcare system. And despite having a similar potential to disrupt services, nurses union lacked capacity to convince a critical mass of nurses to resign, and they didn't act together due to a lack of a well-defined common objective. And for instance, it was perceived that a union demand to increase pay scales based on seniority would deepen inequality between younger and older nurses, and the inability of this union to establish strong connections among members across hospitals led to a lower share of nurses joining the campaign, and it was reported that half of the nurses who resigned were in 2 hospitals. Another difference in their campaign was that doctors used facts to show the detrimental effect of their working conditions on the quality of the healthcare service provided, while nurses union used an emotional argument to gain public support, as indicated by the following quote: the population is aging and we are also aging. Nobody is prohibiting us to work past retirement age, but nurses are leaving because they are physically and emotionally exhausted. So this union has highlighted that nurses are burnout, demotivated, dissatisfied with their wages, but the public perceived that their demands could hinder the operation of hospitals. So the lack of a win-win discourse by nurses contributed to the failure of their action. Now, when unions have developed a feasible action plan, this needs to be put into action. And we have seen in the case of doctors' action that unions generally need the support of their members for the action. And in particular, unions need to rebuild or build solidarity between different groups of workers within the given context. And in our study, the pivotal role played by the solidarity between metal and agency workers is illustrated by the case of ArcelorMittal in Poland, which has actually where 2 trade unions operate. Although both these unions try to address the interests of agency workers, only one of them succeeded, and they changed the work contracts of agency workers into permanent ones by directing all their efforts into organizing agency workers. And these unions focus on strengthening generational and familiar links between standard and agency workers, and a Polish union official stated that we are the only union organization in ArcelorMittal in Poland which embraces those outsourcing companies. We have our members there. The bulk of their employees is made up of the children of past and present employees, and they know that that the unions are active here. So, in contrast, the other union in the same company failed to reduce precarity despite having several attempts through collective bargaining to do so without rebuilding solidarity between standard and non-standard workers. This comparison of those initiatives showed the importance of strengthening internal links between workers on standard and non-standard contracts for reducing precarity, as well as the need to organize them. And the importance of organizing workers, as well as some of the challenges that union federations face in implementing inclusive policies towards agency workers are illustrated by the next example in Slovenia. But first, I'd like to say that in Eastern Europe, the second most common dimension of precarity that unions tried to improve was to provide a voice to precarious workers. And similar to CESI reports, we found that one of the most common successful union actions in representing precarious workers was to offer them individual services such as legal advice or help them to get paid when they weren't paid or when there were delays with their payments. And we found that unions have provided these services even to workers without a contract or illegal immigrants. And although these individual services can make a huge difference to specific workers, we have found that this channel of representation has often limited effects on reducing precarity. And for instance, it was reported that a union initiative seeking to improve terms and conditions of employment for migrant workers in Slovenia, called the Invisible Workers of the World, has itself become invisible as it was dissolved, showing its limited impact on precarity. We found that the most effective way to represent the interests of precarious workers is to organize them. And in Slovenia, findings show that company-level unions can play a crucial role in securing the implementation of rules seeking to protect agency workers. And despite statutory rights for equal pay for agency workers and directly employed workers doing similar tasks in Slovenia, it was reported that only in few companies this provision is implemented. And a successful example was reported in an electric equipment company where the union organized all agency workers who represented around 20% of the total labor force. And findings revealed that the commitment of the local union leader made a crucial difference as she prioritized the interests of agency workers. As a respondent, a union official from the Metal Union Federation indicated in a quote. So he said, the trade union leader in that company has been successful in recruiting agency workers. She pays a visit to them, introduces herself, explains who she is, and asks them to join the union. And she takes care of them in the same way as she cares for her workers directly employed by the company. So the proactivity of this union was key in guaranteeing that agency workers had in practice the same entitlements as their counterparts on standard contracts. Apart from ensuring equal pay, such as base pay, overtime pay, and annual leave payments, this action also contributed to the employment of experienced agency workers on standard contracts. Nevertheless, the Metal Federation reported that company-level unions are often reluctant to prioritize the interests of agency workers. By exerting downward pressure on labor standards, agency workers are often perceived as a threat by union members. And a union respondent specified that we are so passive in Slovenia, everybody is indifferent until the things go to the extreme. I think that's precisely what will happen, and the current system will collapse and every worker will be a precarious worker. But then it will be too late, of course. Everything moves in that direction. So our findings show that solely proactive company level unions that organize agency workers can ensure the enforcement even of statutory provisions for agency workers in a country that has the strongest employment protection in the region. Now, finally, I would like to discuss about external links, and our findings show that strengthening external links with other unions, with community groups, and social movements also can play a crucial role in the success of union actions. And external links may also cover ad hoc interactions between unions and employers or political actors through which the union seek to increase its power. And in our study, we found that unions in Eastern Europe have successfully used the support of their counterparts in Western Europe, primarily to organize workers, particularly in retail, and to provide individual services to the most vulnerable groups of precarious workers, such as migrants, posted workers, and young workers. And in Romania, for instance, the retail union was successful in organizing workers in several large retail chains with the support of the German service union, Verdi. And Verdi provided training for them, and also crucially gave them information about how to get access to relevant senior managers in German companies that decide the terms and conditions of employment in Romania. And this support has helped the union to organize more than 50% of workers in large retail chains such as Metro, Real, and Selgros. This union also asked and got the support of Uni Global, to which it is affiliated, to organize workers at the Carrefour retail chain. And the leader of this union indicated that we had to increase the number of members to support our activities and to ensure our survival. So we see that even union federations talk about the survival, but also show awareness that as precarity is expanding, they need to do something about it. In relation to external links, we also have seen that union can use provisions of international regulations to address precarity. And next, I would like to ask Ashleen to provide a couple of examples of how unions successfully use them in Western Europe.
Now to look at some examples of how trade unions have successfully utilised international labour standards in their fight against precarity. The first example concerns how an international labour organisation convention was used to fight precarity at a national level. And the second example looks at how a global trade union used the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, as a tool to address precarity in a multinational company. ILO conventions and recommendations are drawn up by representatives of governments, employers and workers and are adopted at the annual International Labour Conference. Although most were conceived with standard employment in mind, these instruments apply to all workers. Some standards are particularly relevant for unions fighting precarity. These include Conventions 97 and 143 on the rights of temporary migrant workers, Convention 181, which calls for measures to be taken to ensure that workers recruited by agencies can enjoy the rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining, and Recommendation 198, which sets out how an employment relationship can be determined. French unions utilised the Termination of Employment Convention, number 158, in their fight against new legislation called the New Hire Contract. These new contracts were of indefinite duration, but with extended probation periods of 2 years, during which time workers could be dismissed without justification. At the international level, a French confederation, Force Ouvrière, filed an ILO complaint regarding the new law. The tripartite committee which examined the case found that it was incompatible with Convention 158 and asked the French government to ensure that these contracts could not be used to terminate workers without justification. Parallel to this, the constitutionality of the law was being tested at the national level. French courts, including the Court of Appeal of Paris, found that the new law contravened ILO Convention 158, which France had ratified and was therefore bound by. In particular, the 2-year probationary period was deemed to be in excess of the reasonable duration prescribed in the Convention. Following over 800 legal cases, many new hire contracts were converted into open-ended contracts, and in some cases damages were paid to workers. While ILO standards apply to governments, cases against companies can be taken under the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. These guidelines are a set of recommendations addressed by governments to MNEs operating in or from OECD countries. Since their revision in 2011, these guidelines make explicit reference to labour and human rights standards, including the ILO core conventions and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, creating new opportunities for unions in their fight against precarious work. For example, the International Covenant states that all workers are entitled to the enjoyment of just and favourable conditions of work, including fair wages and equal remuneration for work of equal value without distinction of any kind. It sets out the right to equal opportunity for everyone to be promoted in his employment to an appropriate higher level, subject to no considerations other than those of seniority and competence. An important aspect of the guidelines is that they apply throughout a company's operation, including in their supply chain. National contact points are offices which provide a grievance mechanism to resolve cases related to non-observance of the guidelines. While the recommendations of the national contact points are non-binding, they are public and have been used effectively by a number of unions. The International Union of Food Workers, the IUF, utilised the OECD guidelines in their campaign against Unilever's use of precarious work. One case concerned outsourcing in a Unilever Lipton tea factory in Pakistan. Out of a workforce of 780, only 22 workers were permanently and directly employed. The permanent workers were the only workers who were eligible for union membership and a collective bargaining relationship with Unilever. All other workers were employed through labour contractors with inferior wages and benefits. When bilateral negotiations between the IUF and Unilever proved unsuccessful, the IUF asked the UK National Contact Point to facilitate conciliation and mediation. The IUF and Unilever agreed a settlement in which Unilever agreed to create 200 additional standard jobs, with the selection and recruitment process jointly monitored by the IUF and Unilever. Following 2 further OECD guideline complaints and a coordinated international campaign, Unilever formally recognised the IUF and Industrial Global Union in a Memorandum of Understanding. The parties established a joint platform for dealing with workers' rights throughout Unilever's global operations. Recently, Unilever reached an agreement with the global unions to limit the use of non-standard work and protect standard work in their factories. The agreement applies to workers in over 300 factories in 69 countries, whether they are employed directly by Unilever or through a third party. Under the agreement, Unilever restricts the hiring of temporary workers to short-term and non-recurring tasks, gives temporary workers priority when filling permanent positions, and commits to ensuring equal pay for equal work. The IUF report that the OECD guidelines process was an important element in creating the additional pressure needed to bring the company to the table.
In sum, in a context of weak and declining external resources that unions can rely on to improve working conditions in many countries, we argue that unions have to use their internal resources to address precarity. And we have shown that there are three interrelated internal resources that enable unions to take successful actions, namely proactivity, internal and external links. And all our examples show that proactivity is crucial for designing the strategy on how to address precarity, while internal and external links are vital for the implementation of the selected strategy. And on this slide, we show the interplay of external and internal power resources in Eastern Europe before 2008, when unions benefited from strong institutional support for their activities, including in relation to collective bargaining and their role in tripartite and bipartite bodies in most countries, maybe except Latvia and Lithuania. And in this context, unions in Eastern Europe rarely focus their efforts on increasing membership or strengthening the links with their members. And on this slide, we show that there is a need to rebalance internal and external power resources of unions because of the massive deregulation of the labour markets after 2008. It is critical for unions to focus on strengthening their internal resources. And our examples show that solely unions that had proactive leaders who strengthened internal and external links had the ability to take successful actions to address precarious work. And the key message of this webinar is that it is pragmatic for unions to reach out to precarious workers, to increase their membership, to enable unions to survive. And in conclusion, in relation to the why question, I hope we have convinced you that in a context of expansion of precarity and membership decline, it is vital for unions to focus their efforts on addressing precarity in order to survive. Precarious workers need union support, while also unions need precarious workers to maintain their social role in the society. In relation to the how question, we argue that unions' ability to address precarious work and improve, at least to some extent, their working conditions is contingent on how unions use their internal resources to take advantage of their external context. And more specifically, unions need to take opportunities that arise in their context, which often means taking small steps to improve particular dimensions of precarity based on a win-win discourse for all parties involved. And finally, I would like to thank Ceci for the invitation to the #NoPrecariousWork webinar series. I hope this webinar has provided relevant insights for Ceci members on why and how they can address precarity. And I wish you all the best of luck in achieving no precarious work.
Thank you very much for your attention during this webinar. I hope some of the information we provided is useful, and I would like to wish you and your union the very best of luck in your fight against precarious work. Thank you.